Welcome to Unit 2, Lecture 3. In this one, we are going to be talking about cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is how we take the air and actually use it to power our cells. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration are linked. And remember, we have this thing called the carbon cycle. Okay, so the carbon cycle is actually one of the ways that we link these two things together in a lot of different areas of the world and between a lot of different species. So photosynthesis, you guys probably remember, and we'll talk a little bit more about photosynthesis in depth, but photosynthesis takes sunlight, all right, carbon dioxide, and water to create carbohydrates and oxygen. So carbohydrates, sugars in the form of C6H12O6. Okay, you're going to have to learn that. C6H12O6 is glucose, which we talked about a little bit in the last lecture. And then animals and plants. Plants do respiration as well, and we're going to talk about how they do that, but they don't necessarily release or absorb the same way when we think about these two processes together. But plants do also do both, okay? But animals take that glucose and that oxygen, so you can see that over there, and we end up going through respiration and we create carbon dioxide, water, and ATP in the form of energy, or is the form of energy, I should say. Okay, and so we go around and around and around. So we need to talk a little bit about breathing versus cellular respiration. Breathing is actually the in and out through your lungs. Okay, you can see it right there. So oxygen comes into your lungs, goes into your bloodstream. So if we were to think about this right here, this is your bloodstream, and then into your cells. Then at the cellular level, you are actually going to use that oxygen mixed with glucose. Okay, so that cellular respiration is down here. Okay, so at the cellular level, glucose, that's sugar, and oxygen are used, okay, to create ATP, which is your energy. And we're going to talk a lot more about that. And then we also have carbon dioxide and water produced. So the carbon dioxide goes back to your lungs. Here's carbon dioxide, goes back to your lungs, and then goes out and you exhale it. So glucose comes from your food, okay, and then oxygen comes from the breathing. Okay, and then they combine through a lot of different steps that we're going to talk about. But breathing happens on the whole body scale. Cellular respiration happens in the cell level, okay? Aerobic respiration, aerobic means that it's with oxygen, and it happens in the mitochondria. You probably remember talking about this in elementary or middle school. So the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cells, okay, and then that mitochondria release the energy, and it's also called a redox reaction. So this is Leo says grr. Okay, Leo says grr. So we lose electrons is oxidation, gain electrons is reduction. Okay, and it basically just means that electrons are being transferred from one compound to another. That's all it means. You're going to see a lot more of that in chemistry next year. So Leo says grr. There are a few main steps that I really want to talk about. We've got 1, 2, 3. So you can see 1, 2, 3. So these steps are part of cellular respiration. We've got to go through the whole kit and caboodle. What I'm really concerned with is what you've got going in and what you've got going out. So in, out, okay, and where. All right, this is what I'm really concerned with, okay? So step number 1 is called glycolysis. So you see we're over here. Okay, so in glycolysis, we get glucose. Okay, we get glucose, converts into pyruvate. Right? So pyruvate is an intermediate molecule that goes through some stuff in between, but we're not really going to talk about that too much. So glucose goes in, pyruvate, NADH, and ATP come out. And this happens in the cytoplasm of a cell. Okay, cytoplasm. So when oxygen is available, pyruvate goes into the mitochondria. So now we're in a mitochondria. You can see that here. And we go into step number 2. Step number 2 is called the citric acid cycle. So the citric acid cycle, we end up getting pyruvate in after a couple of little things, but like I said, we're skipping over those. They're in your textbook if you really want to know. We get ATP out, CO2 out, NADH, and FADH2 out. Okay? So remember, ins, outs, and where. So now the NADH here, the NADH here, and the FADH here, okay, all go into step number 3, which is called oxidative phosphorylation. So we're still in the mitochondria. These two things, I should say, NADH and FADH2, those two things go through electron transport and chemiosmosis to make the majority of our ATP. Okay, so we get a little bit of ATP, a little bit of ATP, and then a lot of ATP. Okay, and so the goal here is to get to this step. Okay, anything that derails, okay, step number 3 can actually destroy our cells. And a lot of times when we think about mitochondrial disease, there's a lot of times it's something's wrong with the oxidative phosphorylation step, because that's the one that really makes the majority of our ATP. So we're going to talk about that. Remember, I want you to focus on in, out, and where. Fermentation, okay, which is also known as anaerobic, means there is no oxygen. Okay, and this can happen just in the cytoplasm of any cell. So in the cytoplasm of our cells, in the cytoplasm of bacterial cells, okay, it just can happen in the cytoplasm. So there's 2 types. We get lactic acid fermentation, so we get that pyruvate, and that pyruvate ends up being converted into lactate. So this is muscle burn. So anytime you're doing gym, or you're playing a sport, or you're running around playing whatever, anytime your muscle burns, that's because you're going through lactic acid fermentation. Basically what's happened is you've lost all the oxygen. You've used up all your oxygen, and you've moved into this fermentation. Okay. The other kind is alcohol fermentation. So it happens predominantly in yeast and some other organisms, but what happens here is that pyruvate from glycolysis ends up getting converted into ethanol. Ethanol is actually the alcohol. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're taking that pyruvate from glycolysis. So these are all basically all start with glycolysis, and then that pyruvate is being converted into something else for whatever reason. Okay, so respiration and fermentation pathways. This is one of the things, like I said, this slide is going to be hugely important, even though it looks kind of confusing. All right, we all start with glycolysis. Everybody starts with glycolysis. Okay, here's what it produces. All right, so glycolysis produces 2 ATPs, 2 NADHs, and 2 pyruvates. Then, depending on what the situation is, what organism you're in, what's available, will determine which one of these paths you take. So when we have oxygen, we go through cellular respiration. So you can see that there. When we don't have oxygen, but we're in an organism that can do alcoholic fermentation, not you, okay, we can't do alcoholic fermentation. Okay, we end up getting that. And then in organisms that can do lactic acid fermentation, we are one of those organisms. Okay, then you can go through that. All right, so this map will be helpful, and also the map of the mitochondria, or not just the mitochondria. Where is it? Oh, I can't go back. Okay, but the map with the steps is important. Okay, so wrap up. I want you to post this on Blackboard, use your textbook or the internet to define these terms: NADH, FADH2, glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. All right, I will see you in class.